The BuzzBeater this Sunday, the plight of hurricane-battered Puerto Rico draws modest television coverage for too long, until the press starts blaming it on President Trump. Is that fair? And why weren't news outlets more aggressive from the start? More than a week after an expose by Politico, President Trump fires Health Secretary Tom Price for lavish use of private jets, an outrage that took time to gain traction in the press.
They didn't realize how much we had when we first reported, Chris. They told the White House this would be a one-day story.
Look, I think he's a very fine person. I certainly don't like the optics. I'm not happy, okay? I can tell you, I'm not happy.
President Trump is not upset by what Secretary Price did. He's upset by the negative press caused by what Secretary Price did.
It wasn't fake news. Politico, the reporters tracked this down. They did the reporting.
With Politico reporting that Price charged the taxpayers $1 million for charter and military flights, what took so long? The press throws a penalty flag on the president for talking about pro football instead of other issues, while journalists keep flogging the NFL story over other subjects.
A very full program tonight, including new reporting from Puerto Rico, where the human need is so great in scope and so urgent. We begin, though, tonight keeping them honest with the president's latest take on the wave of protests sweeping the NFL.
The look into the mind of Donald Trump is always Twitter. Today, he has 5 tweets about the NFL and 2 about Puerto Rico.
Trump's not being divisive. The people that kneel during the anthem, I consider that divisive. Trump is criticizing divisive behavior and ripping people that kneel isn't racist.
One, of course, wonders why, in the president's view, a black man protesting racial injustice by kneeling during the anthem is a son of a bitch, while whites marching alongside Nazis in the Klan to protest the removal of the statue of a Confederate general is a, quote, very fine person.
Why are many pundits blaming Trump for their own editorial decisions? Plus, the legacy of Hugh Hefner. Was the Playboy a cultural revolutionary or just selling sex? I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is Media Buzz. It was a classic waste and abuse story when Politico disclosed 10 days ago that HHS Secretary Tom Price had spent at least $400,000 on private jets to visit such places as the Aspen Ideas Festival and a Georgia resort where he owns land, and later another $500,000 on military flights overseas.
But what were you thinking at those moments? I mean, some of these flights clearly were to places that had commercial air possibilities. There's one flight to Philadelphia that you drive 45 minutes to Dulles. You get on a private flight to fly to Philadelphia for $25,000. I mean, you take Amtrak here, you could be there in an hour and a half for about $100.
Yeah, that particular trip, we had a meeting that morning on the hurricanes that I needed to be at, and then we had a meeting in the afternoon at the White House. And again, these trips were approved through the normal process.
There were dutiful follow-ups, a few columns and editorials, but with the secretary insisting he'd done nothing wrong, the story languished until President Trump had had enough on Friday afternoon. An hour after Trump said he'd decide that night whether to fire the ex-congressman, Price resigned. Joining us now to analyze the coverage, Katie Pavlich, editor of townhall.com and a Fox News contributor. Juan Williams, co-host of The Five. And Susan Faricio, chief congressional correspondent of The Washington Examiner. Katie, given that this was a classic scandal from the swamp, why wasn't Tom Price gone in 48 hours? Was that just overshadowed by other Trump stories?
I think the president wanted to make sure he had all the facts surrounding how bad this really was, but the excuses that Tom Price repeatedly gave from the beginning to the end were just pathetic. I mean, he started out by saying, as Brett pushed him on, that, well, he had these meetings and commercial flights weren't available to get back in time, but Politico actually exposed that there were commercial flights almost at the exact same time of the private flights that he took to places that are not far away. And then for him to then try and hold himself accountable in some way by saying, I will pay for my seat on the private plane that I took, just looked even worse when it comes to the overall administration message of making sure taxpayers' money is taken care of in a way that benefits them, not government Washington, D.C. bureaucrats.
One, in terms of spin, the fact that Tom Price, you saw him there with Brett Baer, still seemed not to get it, only paying back a fraction of money. And I love this non-apology. I regret I was not sensitive enough to my concern for the taxpayer. Wasn't that all red meat for the media and keep the story going?
You know, this is interesting to me because it should have been red meat for the media. I think once Politico broke the story, I was very interested in it because it seemed to me such a contradiction of our populist president's appeal to the grassroots, the people who want to drain the swamp. But here's my take on this, Howie. I think we also have to look at the VA secretary. He's been doing some traveling. You look at Ryan Zinke over at Interior. He's been doing some traveling. And, of course, we have the famous case of Mnuchin, the Treasury secretary, and his wife, who had to explain why they were traveling on private jets. I think that, in fact, President Trump is upset at the failure of Tom Price to get rid of Obamacare.
But let's go back to the media focus. So I give Politico credit for old-fashioned investigative reporting, going through the records and so forth. But other news organizations, they didn't really join in the digging. They would report official statements. I mean, CBS Evening News didn't get to us till Wednesday, NBC Nightly News till Thursday, when it became clear that Price's job was on the line. Very little on Fox. Why do you think that was?
Well, I think partly because jet travel from administrative officials is not new. It's been going on, you know, for many administrations.
But at this level, a few months, $400,000?
This was sort of an evolving story. The day that Price announced his resignation was the day we learned about the trips to Europe. We didn't even know about those the day before. I think that was the real kicker here. But it's really important to point out, though, that all the emphasis on Trump and the jet travel, where was all this careful examination during the Obama administration? Leon Panetta used to fly home every weekend to the tune of $800,000. And no one really cared about it. That story never had legs. And so other administrations have done this. I'm glad it's getting a lot of scrutiny now. I never knew about how extensive it was. But again, the radar goes up for the Trump administration. It wasn't there when President Obama was
It is true that a number of Obama officials used private jets, Eric Holder, Loretta Lynch, Bob Mueller, although they at least were law enforcement officials. This guy's running the health department.
Right.
But it is also true that those earlier examples in the past administration were not as big a story.
Well, and also, to be fair, the Obama administration didn't have a mantra or a slogan of making sure that taxpayer money was spent in a way that was helpful and not beneficial to the Washington, D.C. swamp, so to speak. And so, yes, this has been done by previous administrations. It certainly deserved as much scrutiny as they are giving it now. And I think going forward, the Trump administration is actually going to have to come up with a policy, as Juan was saying, rather than just letting Tom Price go as if he's the only person taking advantage of these taxpayer-funded flight loopholes. Why is it not okay for Tom Price to do it, but okay for this Treasury Secretary to do it? And as you said, they're not law enforcement officials, so what is the safety concern?
So, Juan, Kurtz Matthews covered this on MSNBC, and the second paragraph was, well, you know, President Trump is taking all these jets when he goes off for his golfing weekends. And this just strikes me as partisan hackery, because when the president that you oppose is going on vacation, no president is ever really on vacation or playing a lot of golf, then it's an issue. When your own president that you support does it, you get a pass.
Well, of course. And also, it's the President of the United States. You have a lot of apparatus and apparatchiks attached to the President of the United States. You can't make excuses. He must be protected. Security is intense. I used to fly around with Ronald Reagan. That's how old I am. But anyway, there was a lot.
Just you and Ronnie?
Yeah, no. But I'm saying that's exactly. It wasn't just me and Ronnie. I mean, it's like you wouldn't believe how many cars are involved. But the difference, and I think that Susan picked this up, is in the cases that we're talking about, even to this day, there are secretaries who get private transportation because of security concerns.
All right, let me move on to the situation in Puerto Rico, because also in the first week of after that devastating hurricane caused so much havoc on the island, there wasn't the kind of coverage you saw the previous hurricanes. We're going to talk about that next segment, but Susan, now that the narrative have shifted, the media is saying, well, is this President Trump's fault? Why hasn't the federal response been better? Now it's a bigger story. Is that fair or unfair?
Well, I would say this. Let's try to imagine an alternative universe where Hillary Clinton were president right now. What do you think, Howie, the narrative would look like? Do you really think it would be the San Juan mayor proclaiming people are dying and we're not getting any help? I mean, I feel like this. I think that he did well with Texas and Florida, and Democrats were really looking for a way to turn Puerto Rico into a Katrina-like political disaster for Trump. And that's part of what the media narrative has been with this.
Well, it's not just Democrats, Katie. An Associated Press story is making comparisons to Katrina, where obviously the death toll is so much higher on it, tragically. Washington Post, how Trump's time at his golf club hurt his response to Maria. A carefully reported story. But any administration would be struggling with dealing with an island which is more than 1,000 miles from Florida. Just getting in supplies, food, water is very difficult.
Well, and the administration is hitting back on this. You had Sarah Huckabee Sanders yesterday tweeting out a series of informational tweets with timelines of what the administration had done and when, including putting 7,000 federal workers on the ground 2 days after Maria made landfall. And there is a supply and demand issue, and not necessarily an issue with not having enough medical supplies or fuel on the island. That stuff is actually already there. It's a matter of not having enough people to distribute that.
What about the media narrative here that this is a Trump
I think that
failure?
they're not really pointing out that in fairness of, yes, the San Juan mayor is saying these things, but the governor is actually praising the president's response and saying, yes, it's a very difficult situation. We need more help. Obviously, this is not going to be over in the week coming. It's going to be a long-term process. But they have certainly tried to pin all of this on the president and ignored the timeline of what the Department of Homeland Security has done to try and get those people on the ground to distribute those supplies.
CNN had one banner during the day, I believe over the weekend. Trump attacks San Juan mayor as she begs for help. Now, the mayor of San Juan, there's a tweet from the president. Mayor of San Juan was very complimentary only a few days ago, has now been told by Democrats, you must be nasty to Trump, says she's doing a very poor job. And the reaction in some quarters is, oh, he's attacking a woman. He's attacking a woman of color. Isn't he entitled to criticize her back if she criticizes him?
First of all, I mean, what does her color have to? I don't know, but
That's
I mean, I don't think that's relevant. But I do think that's relevant is that from where I can see, the mayor is in a desperate situation and is asking for help on behalf of her people, which is a legitimate political function. Represent your people. I didn't understand President Trump changing the media narrative by engaging in this kind of aggressive takedown of a mayor who's in the midst of a crisis. But he's done this before, but it does affect the media narrative because it's so much like catnip for us in the media to say, oh, Trump is tweeting and is in a fight with the mayor. But the mayor actually is in a desperate situation. Let's not mistake that.
I think we have to have some sympathy for the fact that she's coping with this utter devastation. But here, another tweet by the president. Fake news, CNN and NBC are going out of their way to disparage our great first responders as a way to, quote, get Trump. So now it's about fake news?
I think he's absolutely right to fight against the media narrative here. From the get-go, it has been about him not doing enough to help this desperate situation. Meanwhile, the Defense Department and all our resources are pouring into a very difficult situation. And I can guarantee you, if it was President Obama or President Hillary Clinton, the media narrative would be different. I think that is a black and white fact.
Hold on. Is it all fake news when we have reporters who have gone there? And I don't think it's
that's not what he's saying.
Talking about
that's not what the president's saying.
He's labeling this fake news.
No, he's not labeling fake news that things are desperate in Puerto Rico. In fact, he has talked about that in person on Twitter.
Right.
What he's saying is fake news is the narrative that he's not getting in there and doing everything possible to help the people, even though the situation may still be desperate.
All right, let me get a break here. MediaBuzz at foxnews.com. I'm sure some of you are ready to weigh in. When we come back, more on the hurricane. Why did it take television so long to focus on the devastation in Puerto Rico? And later, critics really unloading on Megyn Kelly's NBC debut. The degree of devastation in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria is almost unimaginable, but for the first 6 or 7 days, the television coverage was quite modest compared to that for various political controversies, and sometimes it was framed like this.
Tonight, the president responds when asked, has he done enough for Puerto Rico? The governor there saying they face a humanitarian disaster.
Growing fears of a mass exodus from Puerto Rico as President Trump defends his administration's response.
A cry for help from Puerto Rico.
Help needs to get into people's hands now, not tomorrow, not later, now.
The president says he's on it.
Joining us now from Miami is Antonio Mora, former news anchor at Good Morning America and a Latin American affairs analyst. And why was there such meager or modest coverage in the first few days? And what do you make now that there is more coverage of the way, for example, those evening news stories were framed?
Well, the reality is, Howie, I don't understand why there wasn't more coverage to begin with. You could give all sorts of excuses that there was hurricane fatigue because we were coming off of Harvey and Irma. The Mexico earthquake was the day before the Puerto Rican earthquake. But how at the networks no voices were raised and said, we've got to cover this other hurricane in the same way that we covered Harvey and Irma. This is also U.S. territory. Puerto Rico isn't that far away from New York City. It's about the same distance as Houston is. So how there were no voices raised and said, we have to send our big guns, just like we sent the big guns to Houston and the big guns to Florida to cover this story. I don't understand that. And honestly, the only way I can explain it from a network standpoint is that simply there's not enough Latino voices at the networks who might have cried out and said, guys, you cannot make this coverage so different.
Let me stop you there because that's an interesting point. I do think some of the major newspaper coverage was better from the start. So I was going to ask you, is this related to the fact that Puerto Rico most of the time is just kind of a blip on the American media radar? But now when you say not enough Latino voices, you're sort of suggesting that Puerto Rico is covered differently because it is an island, not part of the mainland, U.S. territory, American citizens, of course, that is Hispanic and generally impoverished.
Howie, you saw the poll that showed that half of Americans didn't realize that Puerto Ricans were American citizens. So there clearly is a difference in the way Puerto Rico is looked at. There is the aspect that it is a little farther away than Houston or Florida, and so maybe that affects it. But I do believe that there is a lack of Latino representation at the networks, in the executive suites, and the executive producer ranks, on the anchor ranks, from Monday through Friday. 6 a.m. to midnight. There is not one Latino, zero at CNN, Fox, MSNBC, ABC News, NBC News, or CBS News. I would think that if there had been any significant voices in those newsrooms, somebody would have said, hey guys, we've got to cover this the same way. We've got to send Anderson Cooper down there before the storm, not more than a week after. We've got to send Norah O'Donnell down there.
At least he went, and many big name anchors did not. But why should it take, I mean, I take your point about underrepresentation. Why should it take Latino voices to tell the people who make decisions on television networks that Puerto Rico, Americans, 3.5 million folks, and very massive food shortages, water, gas, and all of that. Why should it take Latino voices?
And Howie, it shouldn't. And if you go back and you look at some of the newspaper. Well, I believe it does. And if you go back and look at the newspaper coverage before Puerto Rico, before Maria hit Puerto Rico, it was clear that everybody knew how bad this was going to be. Irma had already knocked out power to 1 million people in Puerto Rico. So a direct hit from a Category 4 storm. You should see what Miami looks like 2 weeks after Irma hit as a Category 1. So you can imagine an impoverished island like Puerto Rico, what it would go through if a Category 4 made a direct hit. So there were already articles talking about how this could mean power out for most of the island for 3 to 6 months. Right. So this should have been a big story that should have been covered very intensely. And I do put some blame on the White House, because I do believe that while they probably underestimated the response. They sent in thousands of people. They did preposition some aid, but clearly not enough.
We are going to get into that in the next segment. Antonio Mauro, thanks very much for joining us from Miami.
Thank you, Art.
Good to see you. Up next, we'll get a response from Puerto Rico's only member of Congress as the media increasingly blame the president for the plight of Puerto Rico. And later, Steve Hayes on why the big media question about the Trump tax cut is whether it benefits him. The moment the coverage of Puerto Rico may have turned came when CNN's Allison Camerata asked San Juan's liberal mayor, Carmen Yulín Cruz, to respond to some upbeat comments by acting Homeland Security Chief Elaine Duke.
I know it is really a good news story in terms of our ability to reach people and the limited number of deaths that have taken place in such a devastating hurricane.
When you're drinking from a creek, it's not a good news story. When you don't have food for a baby, it's not a good news story. When you have to pull people down from their buildings, because I'm sorry, but that really upsets me and frustrates me.
Joining us now in studio is Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, a Republican and Puerto Rico's only member of Congress. Welcome.
Thank you.
The media coverage now is basically portraying the Trump administration's effort to help your island as too slow, too ineffective, basically a failure. Do you find that unfair?
Yes, of course it's unfair. I mean, the federal administration has been there before, during, and after all of the hurricanes. We must remember that we were hit by Hurricane Irma first and then by Hurricane Maria. So it was less than 10 days to recover from the first hurricane when we got hit by the second one. And in the first hurricane, we got 4,000 federal employees in the island before, during, and after. Same thing with Maria. And then the federal government just sent 10,000 persons to work with FEMA and 36 agencies in the island. I think the efforts of President Trump has been amazing, quickly. I mean, he's sending his staff, his secretaries, all his cabinet down the island, making sure that the provisions are arriving, that the commodities are being sent. But he also understands that the main issue we got is the logistics distribution of the supplies.
Right. Well, let me jump in and ask you this, because you were just telling me a moment ago that you were down there during the hurricane holding on to the door of your home. It must have been a very difficult situation. You just heard the mayor of San Juan say that people are dying, she's not going to be polite, the Fed should get their ass moving. So what's wrong with her indictment?
Yeah, I just think that everybody is frustrated here. I mean, we never got this kind of devastation before. So the governor is frustrated, the mayor is frustrated. I'm frustrated because we need more help, and that is the reality. But one thing is saying that, and another one is saying that there's no help, that there's no provisions, that there's no military persons there. I mean, the Coast Guard, Army, Corps of Engineers, you got all federal agencies in the island doing the job as we speak. Rescue missions, more than 800 people being rescued, and continue to do so as we speak. There are ongoing operations for rescue. One thing is ventilating your frustration, and another one is diverting that to take action and to promote coordination with federal agencies. That's what the governor is doing. That's what I'm doing, and and the rest of the mayor. Remember, we got 78 mayors.
Right. Right. This one is getting a lot of television attention, to be sure. The president is tweeting, and he says that some of the coverage of Puerto Rico is fake news. I guess that means to the extent to which the administration is being blamed. Would you agree with that, fake news?
You know what? There's a lot of media covering the disaster, the devastation, and that devastation is true. But saying that the federal government is not there, that is false. I mean, you can walk to the streets and you will see National Guard.
Nobody's saying the federal government's not there. It's a question of whether it moved quickly enough to mobilize the military.
I mean, in less than 8 days, you got a lot of military. He sent 3 generals there. The generals asked for more resources. They are arriving right now. The main issue is the logistics. From the port to the distribution.
I've got half a minute. When the hurricane first hit, there weren't that many journalists who went there. It didn't get all kinds of coverage. Why did that bother you? Why do you think that was?
I mean, it's so easy to take a hit on somebody when they're doing the job and convert this issue in a political one. This is not politics. I mean, this is a real thing. This is a real devastation we got in the island. If some people may play and want to play to hate an administration because they're doing the job, I mean, that's the wrong thing. We need to be united in this effort, Republicans, Democrats, and liberal people, to work with the administration to help solve the situation.
Right. I thought there should have been a brighter media spotlight from the beginning. Congresswoman, thank you very much for coming in at this difficult time. We appreciate it. Head on MediaBuzz, Megyn versus the critics after a rough debut on the Today Show. But first, the press says that after that Alabama contest, there's a Republican civil war going on. Is that hype? Steve Hayes is on deck. President Trump's tax plan is coming under sharp media scrutiny, and many journalists are focusing not on whether it helps the wealthy, but on whether it helps one wealthy person in particular.
Can you guarantee that President Trump won't get a tax cut under this plan?
George, when we've looked at the tax plan and we look what it does for Americans, we are very confident that Americans are getting a great deal here.
Joining us now is Steve Hayes, editor of the Weekly Standard and a Fox News contributor. Let me put up on the screen the USA Today banner headline after the plan was announced. Trump could reap millions in tax plan. Why is this a huge deal? Didn't Bush, JFK, who was rich, benefit from, other presidents benefit from tax cuts?
Yes, no question about it. I think it's the focus of the media because it's Donald Trump. It's a way to hit Donald Trump. Now, in fairness to the media, We don't have his tax returns, so we don't have a real understanding of how he may or may not benefit. But there's been a lot of speculative coverage of the kind that you're describing.
Right, and we don't have all the details of the tax plan itself, and it's understandable, I think, that the media would focus on how, to the degree to which this would explode the deficit. Will these tax cuts be paid for? New York Times saying Republican deficit hawks have barely peaked. But what do you make of that focus on this question of how much it will cost and the deficit?
Look, you're right. It's a perfectly legitimate question to talk about the effects on the deficit. My question for the media is, where was this focus for the last 8 years? I mean, Barack Obama introduced a new entitlement. We know entitlements are driving our debt, our national debt, $20 trillion now. Barack Obama introduced a new one. We've seen the debt number go from basically 11 trillion to 20 trillion under Barack Obama, and there was virtually not a peep from the mainstream establishment media on debt and deficits. And now Donald Trump is president. Republicans push a tax reform plan that, to be fair to Trump, has come up through the Republican Congress. Many of these ideas have been Republican plans for years. And all of a sudden, the media is obsessed with deficits again. I mean, this is, if you ever wanted an example of how the media are biased on these issues, this is a pretty good one.
The deficit is a classic example of hypocrisy on both sides, though, because you make it an issue when it's the other party's responsibility. Okay, so the Obamacare replacement bill failed this week, basically collapsed for the third time. President is out there saying, well, he has the votes and he'll get it in a few months. He talks about one senator being in the hospital. Thad Cochran's not in the hospital, but he is recuperating. A lot of journalists jump in and says, he doesn't have the votes. What's he talking about?
Yeah, he didn't have the votes. What he said was not true. And he said it repeatedly. I mean, what was interesting is he made this claim once. Thad Cochran's people said, well, we're not in the hospital. What are you talking about? There is no hospital.
But he's not in Washington to vote.
He wasn't doing well.
But even if he was here,
that he was going to come back. But even if he was here, you had three Republicans.
Yeah.
So what Donald Trump did was make up an excuse. It wasn't true. I think journalists are absolutely right to fact check him on it and to be aggressive in their fact checking on it. Say what he said was not true.
All right, let me get to the Alabama Senate primary, because President Trump endorsed the appointed incumbent, Luther Strange. He lost to Roy Moore. President campaigned for him. Our colleague Rich Lowry writes that the Republicans are now locked in mortal combat between an establishment that is ineffectual and unimaginative and a populist wing that is ineffectual and inflamed. Sounds like picking sides in the Iran-Iraq war. Where does that leave you?
In the middle, actually. And I think my problem with this whole discussion, first of all, there's been a civil war, if you want to call it that, inside the Republican Party now for a couple of years. I mean, you can really go back to the 2016 presidential election. I think that rupture
Donald Trump essentially took over the Republican Party.
My problem with the coverage broadly is that there is this sort of binary framing where it's the establishment on the one hand and Trumpists on the other. There are a heck of a lot of Republicans, conservatives in the middle of that who are neither Trumpists nor establishment K Street type Republicans, but are movement conservatives who believe in the kind of things that conservatives have believed in for years. And look, you could make an argument that they haven't been aggressive enough in making their case, that they haven't responded correctly to Donald Trump's takeover of the Republican Party, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist, and certainly doesn't mean that reporters should write them out of the story.
Well, you know, media reduce everything to a binary choice, so you for or against this or that.
True.
But as far as you and the Weekly Standard, who opposed Donald Trump during the election, he personally criticized you during the campaign, you don't feel like you have to choose sides, but it seems like you're in this almost no man's land on the right.
Yeah, there's no question this is a very strange moment, I think, for traditional movement conservatives, and most of us at the Weekly Standard are movement conservatives. So what we're doing in response is returning to reporting. We're going back to old school journalism. We believe that the debates that we're having as a country inside the conservative movement should be based on facts, logic, and reason. We're going back to that. We are doubling down on reporting. We're making our arguments based on empirical facts. We're trying to gather, produce original commentary by basing it on what we're seeing rather than hot takes.
I got about half a minute. Is it hard to move the needle with that approach when there's such passions for or against President Trump or the GOP leadership?
Yes, it is. We could fail. It might not work. But if it fails, if going back to facts, logic, and reason fails in this current moment, in this debate, we're going to have bigger problems than just for the Weekly Standard. We'll have problems for the country.
Good point to end on. Steve Hayes, thanks very much for coming in this Sunday. Good to see you. Coming up, a rocky start as Megyn Kelly tries to make the transition from Fox News anchor to NBC morning show personality. And later, the media still keep tackling the NFL protests even as they blame Donald Trump. Many news outlets are still pounding away at the controversy over protesting NFL players, and reporters keep raising the issue with the president.
There's some concern that you were preoccupied with the NFL instead of dealing with Puerto Rico. Why isn't that a fair assessment?
Well, I wasn't preoccupied with the NFL. I was ashamed of what was taking place.
We're back with the panel. Katie Pavlich, Donald Trump absolutely created and promoted this hot-button cultural issue, but the media love this controversy even more than he does and won't let go.
Well, I might disagree with the assertion that he created the cultural problem.
Okay.
It was Colin Kaepernick who started it. President Trump brought it back up and made it a magnified issue.
You'll certainly acknowledge that we all weren't sitting around talking about Colin Kaepernick, who started this protest.
No, but I think that Americans were talking about how during football season with the NFL, people were not standing for the national anthem. So, but he did magnify it. So I would say that, you know, the accusation that he brought it up isn't necessarily true. But the reason why we keep talking about this is A, because the president is talking about it.
Sure.
B, because reporters keep asking about it.
Yes.
And C, because Americans are interested in seeing how this moves forward and whether they're actually going to keep watching football on Sunday and Monday night.
Oh, it's a fascinating story, but it's just so striking to me. Every time this week that the press has gotten to question the president, including a Fox and Friends interview, there's been a question about the NFL, and then it's like, see, you're still talking about it.
Well, wait a second. He's still tweeting about it, too.
That's true.
That's of his own volition. But this is a culture wars issue. I mean, this is something that everybody's interested in. Everybody wants to know what's going to happen in the next game. I remember everybody anticipating the Thursday night game much the way we were anticipating the Sunday games today. What's going to happen? How are the players handling it? The commissioner meeting with players and owners to try to find a way around it. Everybody looking for a way out.
There's a game in London this morning, and it was just striking me that what the real focus now is on the first 2 minutes before the play starts to see what the players do. Susan Faricia, let me play for you something that MSNBC's Rachel Maddow had to say the other night on Jimmy Fallon.
3.5 million Americans in Puerto Rico, and the president was really preoccupied with trying to make a racial issue out of the NFL while he wasn't doing anything about that.
Well, it's not true that he wasn't doing anything about Puerto Rico.
What a thing to say. Okay, first of all, NFL, 16 million viewers. Puerto Rico, 3 million people, 2,000 miles away from the average American. People, as your Antonio Mora just said in the previous segment, don't even know that Puerto Rico is part of the United States. That's part of the reason there's a disconnect between what Americans are thinking about. And the NFL is arguably the most popular sport in America, combined with the President of the United States, whose tweets generate so much interest. You have this perfect combination, really.
I'll tell you what the perfect combination is, and the CNN did a primetime special on the NFL a few days ago. It's the perfect cable news story. It's got Trump, politics, sports, football, race, and people, two sides denouncing each other.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I think that people really are interested in looking at this. And you look at, there are results that are happening as a product of this. I mean, the NFL, there was a Morning Consult political poll that came out this week showing the NFL's brand favorability is lower than it has ever been. And it's gone down by 13% just in the last week. You have a bunch of angry fans being open about the fact that they don't want their season tickets anymore. They're burning their jerseys. They want this to be resolved not by the president, but by the NFL.
A New York Times news story says President Trump is being divisive by pushing the kneeling players as a wedge issue. Isn't there another side, which is, some say, the protesters are being divisive by doing this on national TV? I mean, they could obviously protest away from the field.
I disagree. I mean, I think that they're using a platform that's available to them as athletes in much the way that we as media personalities or actors and actresses, and we often, especially here at Fox, are very critical of the Hollywood elite when they use their platforms.
Can you not see how some people would see that as abusing their platform?
No, I don't. In fact, what's interesting to me is that, as Katie just said, when Kaepernick was doing this, there was some attention to Kaepernick and then some attention to the fact that Kaepernick couldn't get a job this season. But what has happened now is like, it's combusted. It's become a conflagration given the combination that Howie just pointed out, the sports, the media, and Donald Trump.
All right, well, now I guess some of us will have to make a decision on whether to go watch football later Sunday.
I'll be watching baseball because the Nats are playing today.
All right, Juan Williams and Katie Pavlich watching baseball. Thanks very much. After the break, Megyn Kelly says on the Today Show she's done with politics. Can that approach succeed in the morning?